There are a lot of upcoming fantasy games right now, but every now and then, one shows up that feels different almost immediately. And that is exactly the feeling Alkahest gives off. At first glance, though, you might look at this game and think it is just another first-person fantasy action game. Nice visuals, melee combat, dark ruins, monsters.magic. But the more you look at what this gameplay is actually showing, the clearer it becomes that Alkahest is trying to do something much more specific. This does not look like a power fantasy. It does not look like a game where the player is always in control. And it definitely does not look like a fantasy game built around smooth, safe, predictable combat. Instead, Alkahest seems built around pressure, vulnerability, and improvisation. And that alone already makes it stand out. For PlayStation fans, especially people always looking for the next interesting action roleplay games, this is exactly the kind of game worth watching early. Because the main thing that makes Alkahest feel promising is not scale. It is not trying to impress you by looking bigger than everything else. It is trying to impress you by making every encounter feel more physical, more reactive, and more dangerous. And once you understand that, the whole trailer starts to make a lot more sense. One of the most important details here is the simple fact that when your sword breaks, the fight does not pause and let you recover comfortably. You are forced to adapt. That is a huge part of the game's identity. In many fantasy roleplay games, broken flow is usually corrected immediately. You switch weapons, you use a backup, you activate an ability, you go right back into your routine. Alkahest does not seem interested in that kind of safety. Here, failure changes the rhythm of the encounter. It forces improvisation. It pushes the player to use whatever is nearby. And that instantly gives the combat more tension. Because now, every fight feels less like executing a clean plan and more like surviving a situation that can fall apart at any moment. That matters a lot. Because when improvisation is not just optional, but actually core to the experience, the game immediately feels more intense. You're no longer approaching combat like a solved system. You are reacting to it in real time. And that is where Alkahest starts to separate itself from a lot of other fantasy games. The environment is not just there for atmosphere, it is part of the fight. You can pick up enemy weapons, you can use nearby objects, you can kick enemies into hazards, you can turn the space around you into part of your survival. That completely changes the feeling of combat, because the moment the world stops being background, encounters become much more dynamic. Position matters more, timing matters more, awareness matters more. You are not just thinking about your weapon, you are thinking about the room, the terrain, the objects around you, the enemy's position. What can break, what can be used, what can go wrong, and that kind of design always makes combat more memorable. A lot of fantasy games give you beautiful environments, but those spaces often feel passive. They look great, but they do not really participate in the action. Alkahest seems to be going in the opposite direction. It looks like it wants the world itself to be part of the gameplay language. And if the final game really delivers on that idea, that could become one of its biggest strengths. The combat itself also looks much more grounded than what many people probably expected. It is close range. It is weighty. It is rough. There are kicks, finishers, reactive enemy responses, and a strong sense of impact behind every hit. This is not elegant fantasy combat. It is not clean. It is not effortless. And that is exactly why it looks interesting. Because Alkahest does not seem to be chasing style for the sake of style. It looks like it wants combat to feel physical. That is a big difference. A lot of games want to look cinematic, but not many make combat feel truly tangible. Here, the hits look heavy. The movement looks committed. The fights look slightly messy in a good way. And that messiness matters. Because it gives the encounters a sense of danger. It makes them feel unstable. It makes them feel like they can shift at any second. That is much more interesting than combat that always looks perfectly choreographed. And once you combine that grounded combat with the weapon break idea, the whole system starts to look even stronger. You are not playing as an unstoppable hero. You are playing as someone who has to stay sharp, adapt quickly, and use the world around them just to stay alive. That identity is doing a lot of work already. Then you have the destruction and physics systems, and this is where things get even more interesting. Breakable environments and dynamic objects can easily become more than just visual detail. If these systems are consistent, they can change how every encounter plays out, and that is where Alkahest could become genuinely special. Because when destruction and physics are real gameplay tools, every fight becomes less scripted and more reactive. A small moment can create a chain reaction. A missed opportunity can become a problem. A desperate move can suddenly save you. That kind of system-driven design gives combat a completely different kind of energy. Instead of spectacle being handed to the player creates it. And that is always much more satisfying. It is one thing for a game to show you cool action. It is another thing entirely to let that action happen through interaction, timing, and improvisation. That is the difference between something that looks good in a trailer and something that stays exciting after hours of play. So a lot will depend on how deep these systems really go. But based on what we are seeing here, the direction is very promising. Then there is alchemy, and this might be one of the most important parts of the entire game. What stands out here is that Alkahest does not treat alchemy like a traditional spell system. It is not just another layer of magic abilities on top of combat. Instead, it feels focused on reactions, materials, and interacting directly with the world itself. If you compare this to something like The Witcher 3, the difference becomes even clearer. That game is built around scale, narrative depth, and long-term progression. You prepare before fights, you study enemies, you use oils, potions, and science, and over time you become significantly more powerful. The experience is about growth, control, and mastering the systems the game gives you. Alkahest seems to go in a very different direction. It feels less about preparation and more about reacting in the moment. Less about becoming stronger over time, and more about staying alive in unpredictable situations. Instead of building a perfect setup before a fight, you are constantly adjusting during the fight. Weapons can break, the environment can change, and the situation can shift at any second. Of course, execution is everything. All of these systems need to work together. Combat needs to stay responsive, physics needs to feel meaningful, and alchemy needs to feel natural instead of gimmicky. That is always the biggest challenge with system-driven games like this. But based on what we are seeing so far, the direction is very strong. Alkahest already feels like a game that understands its identity, and that is something a lot of games struggle with. It is focused, it is deliberate, and it is clearly trying to deliver a specific kind of experience. So if you are into more grounded, more reactive fantasy combat, this is definitely a game worth keeping an eye on. And if you want to see more breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel and drop a like on the video. Because if the next gameplay reveal builds on what we are seeing here, Alkahest could end up being one of the most interesting fantasy roleplay games in development right now.